I was just heading home after a long shift, one of those nights where you start doubting why you ever signed up for the force. I always thought I'd seen the worst of the city. The junkies, the gang fights, the bloodstains on grimy sidewalks. But this night was about to prove me wrong. My radio crackled as I reached for my car door, nearly making me drop my keys. We've got a possible 10 to 67. An unknown disturbance, south of the pier by Dock 17. Units respond. A shiver crawled up my spine. Dock 17 was practically abandoned. Rotting warehouses and empty ships. A ghost town at night. I could already feel the dread soaking into my bones, but I couldn't ignore the call. I sighed, put the cruiser in gear, and took off toward the dock. When I arrived, it was pitch black. The only light came from my headlights and the faint glow of the city in the distance. There wasn't a soul in sight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, calling in that I'd arrived. As I swept my flashlight around, I noticed something unusual. Thick fog seemed to be drifting in from the water, blanketing the ground like a shroud. Each step felt heavier, like the fog was pulling me in deeper. That's when I noticed it. A figure standing about 50 feet away, half hidden in the mist. I called out, but he didn't move. The figure just stood there, swaying slightly. I approached slowly, hand on my gun. As I got closer, I realized he was in a police uniform, but his back was to me. "Sir, are you okay?" I called again. He didn't respond. I inched closer, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. His uniform was from an older time, like the 70s or 80s. The material, the patches, they all looked vintage. Before I could process it, he started walking, his steps echoing against the silent docks, heading toward one of the abandoned warehouses. Against every instinct, I followed. I couldn't let this go. I had to know what he was doing out here, who he was. As I reached the door of the warehouse, it creaked open on its own. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing my flashlight's beam almost completely. But in the far corner, I saw him again, standing motionless. I took a step forward, and the wooden floor groaned under my weight. Suddenly, the man turned to face me. His face was hidden by shadows, but I could make out two bloodshot eyes staring back at me, unblinking. For a long moment, we just stood there, eyes locked. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of crooked, yellowed teeth. His eyes were glassy, lifeless. In that moment, a memory flashed in my mind, something I'd read in an old precinct file. Back in the 80s, a cop had disappeared on these very docks during a drug raid gone wrong. They'd never found his body, just his badge, washed up onshore weeks later. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. But the man, he started moving toward me. Not walking, but gliding, his feet hovering inches above the ground. My hand flew to my gun, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pull it out of the holster. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in his gaze. "Come join me," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper but somehow filling the entire warehouse. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, I broke free from the trance and stumbled backward. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted out of the warehouse, the man's laughter echoing behind me, growing louder and louder until it filled my head. I reached my cruiser, threw myself inside, and slammed the door. The laughter stopped. My hands were shaking, drenched in cold sweat. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself it was some kind of hallucination, a trick of the fog, anything that could make sense. But as I looked up, he was there, standing right in front of my headlights, his face inches from the glass, smiling that same horrid smile. His voice seeped into my head, as if it were coming from inside the car. "They never leave," he whispered. "Once you're here, you're mine." I slammed the car into reverse, speeding backward, but his face stayed with me, somehow imprinted on the glass, watching, grinning, even as I sped away. It was only when I reached the highway that his image finally faded, leaving only a dark stain on the windshield, like a handprint smudged into the glass. To this day, I avoid Dock 17. I told my colleagues about that night, but no one believed me. But I couldn't let it go. For weeks, every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face staring back at me. Those bloodshot eyes, that unnatural grin. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the taste of fear still bitter on my tongue. I even started to think I saw him around the city, glimpses of that faded uniform in my rearview mirror, or standing in the shadows of alleyways, watching, waiting. It was like he was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. One night, after I'd knocked back a few drinks, I found myself back on my precinct's computer, pulling up the cold case files. The file from the 80s was still there, marked unsolved. The missing officer's name had been redacted, but I could see the details. He'd been a beat cop, working solo in a rough part of town. On his last night, he'd gone out on a call about suspicious activity near the docks. Backup arrived an hour later, but there was no sign of him, just his cruiser, abandoned with the door open and his gun left on the seat. They'd combed the area for weeks but found nothing. No blood, no clues, not even a body. Just his badge, washed up days later, crusted with seaweed. They chalked it up to a tragic accident, probably a drowning, but reading between the lines, I could tell there were whispers, rumors that maybe something else had happened to him, something that wasn't right. As I scrolled through the reports, I noticed a few strange details buried in the witness statements. Locals claiming to see a figure wandering near the docks at night. Sightings of a man in a police uniform that didn't quite look alive. The statements sounded just as insane as what I'd experienced. But there they were, buried in the record, dismissed by whoever had written up the report. As I leaned back in my chair, I felt a strange, cold weight settle over me. What if he hadn't drowned? What if he'd never left the docks at all? That's when I saw the note. It was just a short line, scribbled in faded ink on the last page of the file. It read, "The one who goes to find him doesn't come back." The note wouldn't leave my mind. The one who goes to find him doesn't come back. It was like a warning or maybe a dare. Either way, it burrowed into my thoughts, and before I knew it, I was driving back toward Dock 17. I told myself it was for closure, that I was going to lay it to rest once and for all. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see him again. Needed to understand what I'd seen, even if it meant facing something I couldn't explain. By the time I reached the docks, the city was dead quiet. Not even a breeze to stir the thick fog that seemed to gather around the warehouses like a wall, swallowing all sound. I parked and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, fighting the urge to turn back. But something, maybe pride, maybe insanity, pushed me forward. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel as I moved closer to the old warehouse. The fog was thicker here, so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I kept going, one step after another, until I found myself standing in front of the warehouse door, that same door that had creaked open by itself the first time. Only now it was hanging wide open, swinging gently as though it had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard and shined my flashlight inside. Darkness swallowed the beam almost instantly, like the walls themselves were hungry for light. I could see rows of old crates and broken machinery, shadows slumping in every corner, but no sign of him. I took a cautious step forward, the smell of damp rot filling my nose. Then another step, and another. Each footfall seemed to echo in an unnatural way, bouncing back at me from impossible directions. My eyes scanned the warehouse, jumping at every flicker of shadow, every faint creak. And then I saw him. He was standing in the exact same spot as before, back turned, head slightly cocked to one side, as though he'd never moved, never left. But this time I didn't call out. I just watched, feeling my heart slam against my ribs as I took in the details I'd missed the first time. The uniform he wore looked decayed, frayed at the edges, and his skin, what little I could see of it, was pallid, almost translucent, like he wasn't even real. But the worst part was his breathing. I could hear it, shallow and ragged, like something rattling inside his chest, scraping against his ribs with each breath. He turned slowly, deliberately, until he was facing me again. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an icy terror crawl up my spine. His face had changed. The grin was gone, replaced by an expression of something else. Anger, desperation, pain. He lifted a hand, and I saw the raw, mangled flesh of his fingers, the bones visible where the skin had peeled away. He reached out, his mouth moving, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet, my flashlight shaking as I raised it higher. His hand dropped, and his expression twisted into something monstrous, his jaw dropping open far too wide, as though his whole face was splitting apart. And then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from all around me, I heard him say, "Help me, The words sent a shock through my entire body. I stood frozen, staring into his lifeless eyes, feeling his pain, his anger, his hopelessness bleeding into me. And before I could think, before I could even breathe, I found myself stepping toward him, my hand reaching out instinctively. He looked down at my hand, then back at me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But then, his mouth twisted into that awful grin again. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting the room in shadow, and I saw the shape of other figures lurking in the darkness. Silent, waiting, all wearing the same decayed uniforms, all with that same twisted smile, all staring at me with hollow eyes. My breath caught as I realized they were all police officers, each one frozen in time with a look of agony, their faces twisted into horrific smiles that stretched too wide, eyes vacant and unseeing. They looked like they'd been waiting here for years, decades maybe, just standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. The figure closest to me, the one who'd spoken, the one I'd followed, took a step forward, his hands still outstretched. I could see now that his fingers were misshapen, twisted like they'd been broken 1,000 times and never healed right. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from his eyes. They were filled with something horrible, something that felt like despair woven so deeply it had turned into madness. He took another step toward me, and then I heard it again. "Help me!" But this time, his voice was joined by a chorus of whispers, the other figures all murmuring in unison, their mouths moving but only faint echoes of words filling the space. Each one of them seemed to be saying the same thing, reaching out with hands that looked half-rotted, uniforms faded and torn. "Help us!" Their voices layered over each other, twisting into a sound that seemed to crawl right under my skin. I stumbled backward, my flashlight barely casting enough light to see. But that was when I noticed something. Their eyes weren't empty. They were focused, locked onto me, filled with a hunger that made my stomach twist. These weren't just ghosts. They were trapped here, and somehow they thought I could get them out. The first figure took another step, his smile growing wider, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. I felt his gaze, intense and invasive, as if he were sifting through my memories, my fears, my weaknesses. I could feel his thoughts pressing into my mind, whispering in my own voice, telling me that I belonged here, that I'd never leave, that he would make sure of it. My back hit the cold, hard metal of a crate, and I realized I had nowhere left to go. The figures were closing in, their twisted grins stretching impossibly wide, the sound of their whispers growing louder until it was a deafening roar in my head. "Help us! Help us! Help us!" The figure in front of me leaned in, his face so close I could smell the damp, musty decay clinging to him. His voice softened, barely a whisper, as he said, "It's your turn now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. His hand moved toward my chest, fingers brushing against my uniform, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I felt his touch sink into me, cold and burning all at once. It was like he was reaching inside me, pulling something out, a piece of myself that I'd never get back. Just as his fingers began to close around my heart, I saw a flash of blue and red lights spilling through the warehouse windows, flooding the room with blinding color. The figures around me froze, their heads snapping toward the light. The whispers stopped, leaving a silence so thick I could barely breathe. I didn't wait. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tore myself away from his grasp and sprinted for the door. The figures didn't follow. They just stood there, watching, their expressions twisted with a strange mix of anger and longing. As I burst out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, I saw my cruiser parked just where I'd left it, the familiar flashing lights making my heart race with relief. I jumped into the car, hands shaking so hard I could barely start the engine. But as I drove away, speeding back toward the city, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the dock, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their twisted smiles visible even from a distance. And in the glow of my brake lights, I saw one of them lift a hand, waving me back, as if they knew I would come again, as if they knew I wouldn't be able to escape them forever. I haven't gone back to the docks since that night, but every so often, while I'm out on patrol, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A flicker of movement, a shadow that doesn't belong, and I can feel them out there in the darkness, waiting for me, waiting for the moment when I make the mistake of answering their call. Weeks went by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that night had followed me. It was like a weight pressing down on me, a suffocating presence lurking just out of sight. Every night on patrol, I'd catch flickers of those twisted smiles in alleyways, shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I started sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every sound, feeling that icy chill creep into my bones. Then, one night, everything escalated. I was on a routine patrol near the city's outskirts, an area mostly empty and quiet after dark. I was supposed to be checking in on a break-in call, but something felt off the moment I arrived. The air felt thick, charged with an unnatural cold, and as I parked my cruiser and stepped out, I realized the streetlights were flickering, casting long shadows across the empty lots. I radioed in, but all I got was static, a low, crackling hiss that seemed to whisper my name. My hand tightened on the radio, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing beneath a broken streetlight, just a silhouette against the dark. My heart sank. I didn't need to see his face to know it was him, the officer from the dock. He was closer this time, his face clearer, and as I watched, his grin stretched wider, the darkness seeming to ripple around him. He raised a hand, gesturing for me to come closer, as if inviting me into his world of shadows. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward, then another. It was like he had some hold over me, drawing me in. Every step felt heavier, like I was wading through thick, suffocating fog. And as I got closer, I realized he wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, each one a faded echo of an officer, their uniforms torn and decayed, their faces frozen in that same twisted, impossible grin. Their eyes were empty, yet they stared straight through me, their hollow gaze pinning me in place. I could see now that they were forming a circle around me, closing in, step by silent step. The one in front, the one who'd spoken to me that night at the docks, tilted his head, as if studying me. His mouth moved, but his voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that clawed into my thoughts. "You're one of us now," he said, his words crawling through my skull like ice water. No, I managed to choke out, taking a step back, but it was like my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by their gaze, as if the very ground was holding me in place. They moved closer, their hands reaching out, and I felt the weight of their touch, cold and suffocating, pressing against my chest, my shoulders. The leader leaned in, his mouth mere inches from my ear. "Once you've seen us," he whispered, "you're ours. You can run, but you'll always find your way back." I felt something clawing at my mind, burrowing into my thoughts, like they were trying to pull me into their world. My vision began to blur, the world around me fading until all I could see were their faces, twisted and smiling, waiting for me to join them. But then, in a last burst of desperation, I forced myself to move. My hand closed around my flashlight, and with a surge of adrenaline, I swung it around, shining the beam straight into their faces. The light seemed to sear through them, cutting through the darkness, and for a brief moment, I saw their expressions twist, not with malice, but with something close to fear. The figures shrank back, their forms flickering like shadows under the harsh light. The leader's grin faded, replaced by a look of rage, and he let out a guttural scream that echoed through my mind, a sound that was more than human, more than alive. The others joined in, their voices a haunting wail that filled the night. I stumbled back, breaking free from their circle, and I ran. Ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see if they were following. I just kept running, through empty streets and alleys, until I reached my cruiser. I threw myself inside, locking the doors and fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. As the engine roared to life, I peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away, the city lights finally fading in my rearview mirror. But even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can still feel their eyes on me, hear their whispers echoing in my head. They're out there waiting, watching, and every night, I know they're getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep running, how much longer I can keep the darkness at bay. But one thing is certain. Once you see them, once you feel their touch, there's no going back. They'll haunt you, follow you, until you're one of them. And one day, I know I'll find myself back at those docks, stepping into the shadows to join them for good. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, caught between the world of the living and whatever those things were. They had latched onto me, pulling me closer to them every night, and I could feel it. The nightmares had gotten worse. I'd wake up with the sheets soaked, the sound of those whispering voices still rattling in my head. And it wasn't just at night anymore. I'd catch glimpses of them in reflections, shadows in the glass of my squad car, staring back at me from the depths of mirrors in dark hallways. They were everywhere, waiting for me to slip up. It finally pushed me over the edge one night when I was filling out paperwork at the station. I was the last one there, working under the flickering fluorescent lights, the silence pressing in around me. I was barely focusing, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard a faint tap from the hallway outside my office. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was slow, deliberate, getting closer with each step. I glanced at the clock. It was past 3 a.m. Nobody else should have been in the building. I called out, but my voice sounded small, weak, swallowed by the darkness creeping in from the hallway. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared, half expecting someone to burst in. But the silence stretched on. Then, just as I thought I'd imagined it, a shadow appeared in the thin strip of glass on the door. It was him, the officer from the docks, staring in at me with those hollow, bloodshot eyes. His face was pressed up against the glass, his expression blank, lifeless. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air grew thick, and I was paralyzed, just staring into those dead, empty eyes. Then he started smiling, slowly, his lips curled up, stretching wider and wider until it was more like a grimace, teeth bared in a mockery of human expression. His hand pressed against the glass, and I could see the rotted, decayed flesh of his fingers, the dark veins snaking up his arm. I forced myself to stand, every muscle screaming with fear, and backed away from the door. He didn't move, just kept watching, his grin widening, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the glass. And then, as if he sensed my terror, he mouthed 2 words, "Join us." The lights in the station flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My heart stopped. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my flashlight, and when I flicked it on, the beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the walls. But when I pointed it back at the door, he was gone. The glass was empty, just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the office, heart racing, barely able to keep the flashlight steady. As I ran down the hallway, I could feel them behind me, shadows slipping out of the walls, figures watching me from the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. I burst out of the station, gasping for air, the cold night hitting me like a slap. But I didn't stop. I ran to my car, threw myself inside, and took off, driving aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was haunting me. After that night, I didn't go back to the station. I called in, made excuses, tried to stay away from anything that reminded me of them. But it didn't help. They were always there, in my mirrors, my windows, my dreams. And no matter how far I drove, how many lights I left on, I couldn't escape them. It was then that I realized what they wanted. They didn't just want to haunt me. They wanted to replace me, to drag me into their world and make me one of them. A ghost, a hollow echo, doomed to wander the empty streets, forever watching and waiting for the next unlucky soul. Now, as I write this, I know my time is running out. I can feel them getting closer, their whispers louder, clawing at the edges of my mind. I don't know how much longer I can resist. Maybe this is how it ends. Maybe I'm just the latest in a long line of officers who thought they could handle the dark secrets of this city, only to be consumed by them. So if you're reading this and you find yourself at Dock 17, if you see a figure in a faded uniform staring at you from the shadows, don't go any closer. Don't look into their eyes, and for the love of God, don't listen to their whispers. Turn around, walk away, and whatever you do, don't let them in. I thought that by writing it down, I'd be able to put it behind me. But they say that when you give something a name, when you acknowledge it, you're inviting it in. And that's exactly what happened. The following night, I was trying to sleep, exhaustion settling deep in my bones, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those twisted smiles, the hollow eyes watching me from the darkness. I finally drifted off, but it wasn't a restful sleep. It was the kind of sleep where you're half aware, caught between dreams and waking, knowing something's wrong but unable to move. And then I heard it, the tapping. It was faint at first, like a gentle knock, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing through my skull. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't in my head. It was coming from the window. I sat up, slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But something deeper, something dark and twisted inside me, compelled me to turn. My bedroom was drenched in shadow, save for the faint light of the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the room. And there, silhouetted against the window, was a figure. It was him, the officer. His face was pressed against the glass, just like it had been at the station, his eyes fixed on me, unblinking. His smile stretched impossibly wide, lips splitting and peeling back to reveal yellowed teeth, and his fingers tapped against the glass in that same rhythmic pattern. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, locked in place by his gaze, and all I could do was watch as he slowly lifted a hand, pressing it flat against the window, his grin widening. Behind him, in the shadows beyond the glass, I saw movement. Other figures half-formed, their eyes gleaming with that same unholy hunger. They were all watching me, waiting, like wolves circling their prey. "Come with us," he whispered, his voice slithering into my mind, filling every corner, every thought. "You're one of us now." I felt something cold seep into my chest, like icy fingers wrapping around my heart, pulling me toward him. My vision blurred, the room spinning, and I realized with a sickening dread that I was slipping away, my thoughts unraveling, memories fading. I could see flashes of my life, moments with friends, with family, laughing, living, and each one felt more distant, like they belonged to someone else. I struggled, fought against the pull, forcing myself to remember who I was. But his voice was there, drowning out my own, whispering promises of eternal peace, of a place where I wouldn't have to fight anymore, a place where I could rest forever. I don't know how I managed it, but somehow I tore my gaze away from him, breaking the trance. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the only person I could think of who might believe me, my old partner, Jackson. He was off the force now, retired after a nasty accident, but he'd seen things. He knew the kind of darkness that lurked in this city. The phone rang once, twice, and then his groggy voice answered. "Hello? Jackson," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "They're here. They're trying to take me." There was a pause, and then his voice came back, sharp and awake. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I don't know," I choked out, glancing back at the window. The officer was still there, watching, his face pressed so close that it looked like he could melt through the glass at any moment. "I don't know how much longer I can hold them off." "Listen to me," Jackson said, his voice steady, grounding. "Get out of the house. Don't look at them, don't listen. Go somewhere bright, somewhere they can't follow." I nodded, barely registering his words as I stumbled to the door, grabbing my keys and flashlight. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to unlock the door, but finally, I was outside, gulping down the cold night air. I got into my car, locking the doors, and took off down the street, driving with no destination in mind, just trying to put distance between me and whatever was haunting me. I drove until I reached the outskirts of town, where the city lights faded and the road stretched into darkness. I was alone, nothing but the quiet hum of the engine and the faint glow of the dashboard to keep me grounded. I thought I'd escaped, that maybe I'd outrun them. But then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my taillights. They were all police officers, their uniforms faded and torn, their faces locked in that same unnatural smile. They watched me, unmoving, their eyes gleaming in the dark, and I realized with a cold, sinking dread that no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape them. Because they weren't just in the docks or the station or my house. They were in me. I felt it then, the cold, creeping sensation spreading through my veins, freezing me from the inside out. I knew what it meant, knew what I'd become. And as I sat there, staring into the faces of the dead, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't running from them. I was joining them. With a final, shuddering breath, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, walking toward the figures, my own face splitting into a wide, unnatural smile. And as I joined their ranks, I felt a strange peace settle over me, a quiet acceptance. Because in the end, we're all just shadows, waiting to be seen. I took that first step toward the figures, feeling an eerie calm settle over me. The fear, the desperation, even the memories, they all started to fade, replaced by a hollow kind of peace. My mind was no longer my own. It felt like I was drifting in a fog, barely aware of my own movements. I was becoming one of them. But then, out of nowhere, I heard something. Faint at first, but growing louder, cutting through the fog like a lifeline. The sound of a car engine. Headlights beamed down the road, illuminating me and the row of spectral officers standing at attention in the middle of the street. The car came to a screeching halt, and I squinted, trying to make out who was inside. The door swung open, and a familiar voice broke through the night. "Hey, get away from them." It was Jackson. I could barely process it, but he was there, standing outside his car, a flashlight in one hand, looking straight at me. The light cut through the fog, reaching my eyes, piercing the trance like a blade. For a split second, I was myself again, staring at him in disbelief, feeling the weight of reality slam back into me. "Jackson," I managed, but my voice was weak, barely a whisper. He took a step closer, the beam of his flashlight illuminating my face. His eyes were wide, full of fear but also determination. "You don't have to do this. You're still here, I can see it. Don't let them take you." The figures behind me began to stir, their hollow eyes turning toward Jackson, expressions twisting into a look of raw, animalistic fury. Their smiles faded, replaced by something dark, something hungry. One of them stepped forward, reaching a withered hand toward him, fingers curling like claws. "Get out of here," I croaked, finding my voice. "They'll take you too." Jackson shook his head, defiant. "Not tonight. I didn't come here to lose you." With that, he reached into his coat and pulled out something I hadn't expected. A handful of road flares. He struck one, the bright, searing red flame casting a harsh light over the road, illuminating every shadow, every twisted face. The figures recoiled, their eyes narrowing against the sudden brightness, hissing like wild animals, their shapes flickering in and out of focus. Jackson threw the flare onto the ground between us, the red light cutting a line between me and the dead. The figures shrank back, their forms wavering, as though the light was burning them. For a moment, they seemed almost afraid, their hollow eyes darting between the flare and Jackson. "Come on," Jackson shouted, reaching out a hand toward me. "You have to fight it. This is your last chance." I hesitated, feeling the pull of the figures behind me, their silent promises of peace, of release, of a world without fear or pain. But then I looked at Jackson, his face full of raw determination, and something inside me snapped. a sliver of defiance that cut through the fog. With every ounce of strength I had left, I staggered toward him, my body feeling heavy, as if I were dragging chains. The figures hissed, their faces twisting with rage, but they didn't step forward, held back by the light of the flare. I reached Jackson, grabbing his outstretched hand. The warmth of his grip sent a shock through my body, grounding me, pulling me fully back into myself. Together, we stumbled toward his car, the flare's light casting long shadows behind us. Just as we reached the car door, I made the mistake of looking back. The figures were standing at the edge of the red light, their faces twisted into expressions of pure hatred, their eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I realized the truth. They weren't just angry. They were waiting. Jackson started the engine, and we sped off into the night, leaving the figures behind in the glow of the flare. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped, that a part of me was still back there, standing among them in the dark. After a few minutes of silence, Jackson finally spoke, his voice low and grim. "They're not gone, are they?" I shook my head, staring out the window at the passing shadows. "No, they'll never be gone. Not for me." Jackson nodded, his expression heavy. "But you're still here. That's what matters." I didn't respond, because deep down, I knew that this wasn't the end. The dead don't just let go. They wait, and someday, somewhere, they'll come for me again. And when that day comes, I don't know if I'll have the strength to resist. The weeks that followed felt like I was living in borrowed time. Jackson checked in on me regularly, trying to keep me grounded, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew, just like I did, that it was only a matter of time before they came back. We both avoided talking about that night, as if not speaking of it would keep the shadows at bay. But no matter how hard I tried to live normally, the feeling of being watched, of being stalked, never left me. Then, one night, the inevitable happened. I was in my apartment, the city lights casting an eerie glow through the blinds, when I felt the shift in the air. The room grew cold, so cold that my breath came out in white puffs, and the shadows seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners, stretching toward me like dark, grasping fingers. I knew they had found me. A soft, rhythmic tapping filled the room. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't have to look to know where it was coming from. I turned slowly, every muscle tensed, to see my reflection in the window. But instead of my own face staring back, I saw him. The officer from the docks, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes hollow, empty, yet somehow filled with that sickening hunger. His smile stretched wider, splitting his pale skin until it looked like his mouth might tear open. "Come back to us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Yet it filled my head, drowning out my own thoughts. "You were meant to join us. You cannot escape." The shadows in the room began to pulse, creeping closer, swirling around me. I could feel them wrapping around my arms, my chest, dragging me down, pulling me toward the darkness. My legs felt like they were encased in ice, unable to move, to run. But then, a voice cut through the silence. "You don't have to listen to them." It was Jackson. He was standing at my doorway, eyes wide, jaw clenched, gripping a small crucifix in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I had no idea how he'd known to come, but in that moment I didn't care. Just the sight of him there, solid and real, was enough to give me the strength I needed to fight back. "Jackson," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "They're here. They're not letting go." He stepped forward, his flashlight blazing, casting the room in a stark, white light. The shadows recoiled, hissing, their forms flickering in and out of sight. But the officer in the window remained, his gaze locked onto me, his smile never faltering. "You can't have him," Jackson shouted, holding the crucifix up, his voice steady and unyielding. "He's not yours." The officer's face twisted, his grin fading, replaced by something darker, something filled with rage. He pressed harder against the glass, his hands splayed out, fingertips pressing so hard they left smudges on the window. "He belongs to us," he hissed. "Once you've seen us, there's no escape." I felt a surge of defiance rise up in me, a spark of the old me fighting against the shadows. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stand, to step closer to the window, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm not yours," I whispered, each word laced with every ounce of strength I had left. "I never was." The officer's face contorted, his mouth opening in a silent scream, and the shadows around him began to dissolve, breaking apart like smoke caught in a strong wind.